So, complex leadership and attitude and framework. Well, I'm slightly biased on this, but I created the Cynefin framework, which is used in the US Army, the US Navy, has been adopted by the EU and elsewhere. And that identifies 5 states: complex, complicated, clear, chaotic, and confused. And part of the key process on leadership is to realize which, and this is on, to use the academic phrase here, ontology precedes epistemology. You need to realize what type of system you're in order to determine the right action. So we generally start in what used to be called disorder, is now called confused. And what you really need to do is, if you can shuffle problems into deep expertise, you do that because that's complicated, you know what to do. You as a leader should be focusing on the complex issues. And the complex issues, you deploy the sort of software I've talked about. Now you deploy 50 or 60 teams with cognitively diverse groups in small numbers and allow different deliberate conflict between those. You do parallel safe to fail experiments or parallel risky experiments in a crisis. You need to cast around for what's possible. And there's a whole body of work. I've got a front cover Harvard Business Review article, which I think is one of the top 5 on leadership in complexity, which is available and you can read, and that describes that sort of leadership attitude on that site. Yeah. See, we're not trying to build a narrative for COVID. That's a sort of systems thinking type approach, is what's the narrative, we need to design it. What we're trying to identify is what current patterns in people's day-to-day stories could be amplified so that a narrative evolves and emerges, which gives us a better future after COVID. And I can't overemphasize this. Complexity theory is all about finding something which can be given energy, which can evolve in a favorable direction, rather than trying to impose something based on idealism within the future. Yeah. Lots of things on sense making. The key thing is this point about diversity, right? And so I'll come back to this point of Gary Klein, who's a good friend and colleague, right? He famously argues, and I fully agree with him, that there's no such thing as a cognitive bias. Evolution produces things which have utility. The reason we have biases is that overall, they reduce the energy cost of making decisions. It's just sometimes they don't work. So if we recognize that, then we need to start to realize that human beings evolved to make decisions in extended families and tribes, not as individuals. And actually, collectively, intuition is very good, whereas individually, despite the nonsense of Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, it's actually very bad. Yeah. So cognitively diverse, experientially diverse networks, doing situational assessment in real time, outlier identification, finding the 15%, providing energy into things. Those are all aspects of this. And in a complex adaptive system, there are only 3 things you can actually manage. So this also helps in a crisis. One is the constraints, and you can add constraints, remove constraints. You can make constraints permeable. Constraints can enable or they can govern. You can manage catalysts, i.e. things you do to see if a pattern will form. And you can manage the energy allocation to successful patterns or the energy withdrawal from unsuccessful patterns. So that's all you can do. Everything else is a waste of time. There's a whole list of things that you can manage and things that you can monitor within the handbook. So focusing on constraints, focusing on catalysts, focusing on large sensor networks, and focusing on rapid amplification and rapid dampening, that's how you do sense making. Okay, that's a good, I mean, Trump is, the trouble at the moment is every time somebody argues against Trump from a liberal perspective, particularly if they're what used to be called a Boston Brahmin, but I may be showing my age in using those terms. The trope which Trump is activating has already evolved to handle that. And that's actually quite scary, because what it means is that most of the liberal criticism of Trump actually increases the energy to the tropes that he's actually helped get him elected, and it's quite scary. The way you do this is not there. Well, there are some scary ways of doing it, which is you can introduce retroviruses into the narrative patterns. which cause the patterns to self-destruct. And that's quite a scary technique, and I'm not sure about the ethics of it, but we have done that. The other one is to create it's called, Stu Kaufman calls the adjacent possible. You find a weak attractor, and remember that picture I show you, that's an attractor landscape. You find a weak attractor in a better place than a negative attractor, and you increase the energy allocation to that, so it sucks energy away from the negative. You never address the problem directly, you address it indirectly. Yeah, I could go on at that in more length, but that's one of it. And I think the problem we got with truth at the moment is because experts dispute and because the information flow is instantaneous, it's like the stuff on masks, all right? People have just lost trust in experts. And there's no authoritative source like there used to be in the television channels to determine which expert you should listen to. So it's not that people were ever rational decision makers, they never were, they just delegated to experts. And that kind of like hasn't worked with neoliberalism. So now they're trying populists for a change, right? So the key thing is community-based filtering, yeah? I mean, Lloyd's asked a good question. I mean, we're no different from anything else. The volume matters, right? So I can send you the article on this. There was an article written by an anthropologist who worked in Nokia. I forgot her name now, but she argued that you needed big data and what she called thick data. So if you can imagine a 2x2, on the vertical dimension, you've got number, on the horizontal dimension, you've got meaning. So she basically said big data is like a column to the left. It's high volume, low meaning, whereas ethnography is low volume, high meaning. And then she said, but you can't use anecdotal data because you have to ask people questions to stimulate it so you as the expert can interpret it. Right? Now, what we do is called rich data. So by allowing the respondents to self-interpret their own data, we can use anecdotal data and we can use non-text-based data, and we can use it in very high volume in real time. But that's why you want to ensure diversity. So my idea for children, for example, does that automatically. If every 16-year-old in every school in the world as part of United Nations project captures stories, I've got the right level of diversity. Yeah? If I've got people in my organization, or the other one we've used is university students, I've got enough metadata about them that I can make sure my panels are objective, yeah, and have the right level of diversity. And the bigger the panels, the less a problem it is, right? I think one of the key things we do is there's a lot of people who've used the wisdom of crowds concept, but they use experts to interpret the data, or they use artificial intelligence to interpret text. We actually can do both, but our primary interpretation is the person who contributed the material, which means they can contribute pictures as well as text, and also voice as well as text. And because they're actually doing their own interpretation, yeah, we're not subject to the cognitive bias of the training algorithms for the AI or the time delay of the expert assessment. It literally is in real time. So that landscape I showed you, you can actually see it changing as people respond onto the actual system. Yeah. People don't take well being talked at by experts or politicians. It kind of like doesn't work. So there's several things we can do on that. One is if we use these narrative databases that we've got, which are based on people's own stories, is what we recommend to politicians is they repeat the stories back to people. This, by the way, is a whole new theory of change and a whole new approach to behavioral economics. Is basically what you say is, look, guys, we need more stories like these and fewer stories like those. And that can be understood at any level. So if you say, you know, as a leader, we need more of these stories and people know those stories came from the field, that has more power than if you give an abstract injunction. The other thing is you need to create ritual transitions. We've done a lot of work on this in safety, but you only scan about 3 or 4% of what's in front of you before you make a decision anyway. What ritual does is it changes which 3 or 4% of your memories you use for the scanning. And so building rituals in as people go into crisis teams, you know, getting them to put on uniform, for example, can radically change the way they think, yeah? And that shifts the identity structure, yeah? So if you participate in this, we'll give you access to the report. I'll also put into the pack a major report we've recently done on Africa on measuring resilience, which use the tool, and we'll make that available so you can see it. But we're actively looking for problems and networks to use. And by the way, if you've got an organization and you want to engage in this as an organization, we can give you a unique URL so you can track your own data. Yeah. Smaller organizations are actually key here. The other thing we're launching with the UNDP and with the International Red Cross next week is a journaling system, so that anybody in any organization can capture narrative-based interviews, their own observations, and share that peer-to-peer, yeah, as well as the whole. Okay, Hanno, for a start, don't confuse systems thinking with complexity theory. The systems thinkers all think complexity theory is a part of it, isn't it? It's radically different. The key difference is that complexity theory deals with systems which don't have linear causality. And so the feedback loops can't be controlled. If I've written 4 or 5 articles on this, jointly with Kurtz, jointly with Mary Boone and others, those are on our website, or if you go onto Google Scholar and search on Cynefin, C-Y-N-E-F-I-N, which is the name of the framework I created, you will find an awful lot of applications. There's a rather delightful article by somebody who used it in the British Cabinet Office and Secret Service to explain the role of religion in the Bush White House, which is still one of my favorites. And it was heavily developed in Naval Postgraduate School as well. So there's stuff there, yeah.